Hey everybody, welcome back to another of Adam's Reviews. And today I'm going to start off by just saying I had recorded this whole thing yesterday, and unfortunately I had a malfunction with one of my microphone cables where the little receiver plastic piece inside of it had slid to the point where it wasn't making a connection, and I have no audio on the main footage that I actually shot. And I would set everything up, but it took me pretty much all day yesterday to get everything all set up and then torn back down. So I don't want to do that today. So you have to bear with me. I will show some of the footage of what I shot yesterday so that way you can kind of get an idea, because I was using the slider all day yesterday when I was recording the actual video. So I'm going to go through with the pros and cons, first of all, starting with the cons and then moving into the pros. So that way I can kind of wind up with more of a pros kind of thing, because I want to end things on a negative kind of feel, right? So the thing that I'm reviewing is the GVM Motorized 31-inch slider, and it costs about $360 off of Amazon as of the time that I shot this video. And there's actually also a newer version of this available, and it is $390. And the only difference between the two of them that I can see is that the motor is mounted on the side of the rails now, as opposed to the one that I have, which is mounted on the actual dolly itself that's on the rails. The rails themselves, it's, from what I could tell, they are identical. So there has been no change with the rails or the way that the rails work. So with that said, let's start off with some of the cons. And that is, the memory is lost every time that you power it off. So there's a technical limitation that's understandable as to why they did this. So every time that you power it on, you have to set the start point and the end point, because it has the controller has absolutely no idea where it is on the rails. So you have to set that up every time. One of the things that you can do is that when the motor is powered off, is you can actually use this as a manual slider if you want. You can grab the dolly and just move it up and down the rails. And that's the reason why it has to be calibrated every time that you turn it on, because it has absolutely no idea where it is on the rails when it's been turned off, especially since you can move it manually. And there's gaps in when the direction is reversed due to the massive amount of play in the base plate. And I show this here, and you can see that there is a ton of movement in that base plate. And what winds up happening is that when the system reverses itself, it'll take a minute for the tension to kind of play into that rod as to turn the dial underneath it, which is what makes that base plate turn. The other thing is that you really do have to use a ball head on this thing, because there's no real way to adjust the mounting plate if it doesn't line up. So in other words, if you want to take your camera and just screw it directly on top of the base plate, chances are it's not going to line up straightforward. So you're going to have to go ahead and use a ball head in order for you to be able to twist it and line it up properly. If you try and just use a straight plate, like a Z plate or something like that, which is what I was using, you're not going to be able to get it to line up right off the bat, and there's no way to adjust that on the actual mounting, the base plate itself. So you can kind of get around that. You can use some washers to try and help line it up. I had to use 2 washers, and that allowed me to line my Z plate up directly forward. So you can get around it. It's just, I don't know, I guess they probably didn't include something like that just to kind of dial back on the cost, because let's face it, this thing, for a motorized slider with all the features that it does, it's pretty dang cost effective. Now, with a mechanical tracker, it's just not accurate and it's kind of clunky. So if you're trying to do a tracking of something that's really tight in with using a macro lens or something like that, you're going to have a big problem trying to get this thing to be precise and to maintain tracking on the subject that you're trying to align it on. That's just sort of the nature of the beast with these manual trackers, and the way that they operate is that, I think I kind of mentioned that a little bit, but there's a rod that goes in between the 2 rails, and on the bottom of the base plate, there's a little metal slot that basically that third rod rides in. And when you tilt that rod either diagonally one way or the other, that causes the base plate to kind of turn as those things are, the 2 pieces of metal kind of running along that rod as a guide. So it kind of you'll see what I mean looking underneath it. The control menu is terrible and it is unintuitive. It is absolutely, when you first get this thing, you're going to be probably puzzled unless you've gone out of your way to look up YouTube videos to figure out how to actually operate that controller. The way that you work it, and this is the big thing. I don't know why. Well, I can kind of understand why they probably didn't include a back button, and the reason is probably again a cost-effective, cost-saving measure that they took. But what you have to do is that as you drill down into these menus, you single click real fast with the middle button to go into a deeper menu. And to get back out of those menus, you have to press and hold the center button, and that'll bump you up one level in the menu system. That is the one big pitfall that I think a lot of people have experienced. And I've watched a few other videos where people have talked about this, and they've ran into the same kind of problems. Luckily for me, it wasn't really an issue just because I had already gone and looked at some YouTube videos to figure out how to use it. So I knew right off the bat that you had to go ahead and press and hold that middle button. But there's no real instructions with this thing. I mean, they're very, very, very limited with what they tell you to do, and it doesn't tell you how to go about maneuvering through the menu systems using the controller. And the leveling system, it's painful. It consists of the feet that kind of screw in and out to adjust the height. So there are a lot of other sliders that are out there where you can kind of adjust the feet themselves. They'll kind of like have little detention points where you can kind of lock it into place and screw it, and that's how you'll go and level it. With this, unfortunately, you don't have that. You basically move the feet out and it slides all the way out into one specific position, and then you have to unscrew the feet and they'll slowly kind of come out, and that's how you balance it, either forward and backwards or side to side, or if there's little diagonal adjustments that you need to make. That's the only way that you can do it, and that's pretty painful. The belt storage would be hassle, as you have got to completely remove the belt tensioners. And the reason why you want to pull the belt off is that if you're not using this thing for an extended period of time, if you just leave the dolly and the motor parked on that belt, eventually that belt is going to kind of not wear, but it'll kind of create sort of a memory. The rubber will kind of develop a memory, and you'll have a little bit of a divot that'll be on that belt. That belt has got to be as smooth as you possibly can, because the smoother the belt is, the easier it's going to have as it goes up and down to make the pan shots. And if it hits a little divot, it's going to translate into a little bit of a shake on your camera. Not desirable when you're trying to get super duper smooth shots. And it's absolutely not useful for macro shots. And that is the reason why I can't use this, is because the majority of the stuff that I do, I'm sure you've noticed if you've seen any of my other videos, I do a lot of product reviews. And one of the reasons why I bought this is that I wanted to be able to get in some nice, close, tight shots of products and have a nice, smooth pan with it. And if I need to get in real super close with a tight shot, especially with a macro lens, because also my wife, she makes these resin cast little models of like little food things, and they're really, really small, and I have to use a macro lens. So that means I've really got to get in there super tight. And because of the play that's on that base plate, whenever it tries to reverse direction, or whenever I try to like start the motion, unless that base plate is already all the way up against those guiding, I don't even know what to call them, just the guides that are underneath the rails, it's gonna have a little bit of play. It's gonna take a minute for it to actually start tracking as it's moving. So it's really, really, really painful. Now, if you're going to be using this for just kind of doing talking head sorts of interviews or something along those lines, where it's kind of a wider shot, you're not really tight in on a subject, it'll probably work just fine. And given the fact that this is really cheap and it's got a lot of functionality built into it, where you can do tracking shots, you can do panorama shots, you can do a smaller range of motion. Like if you have like one of the larger sets of rails, I think it comes with like a 41-inch or a 43-inch rail system as well. So even if you have a really, really large one, the controller allows you to narrow down the actual amount of travel that you want, which is good, because that way if you only have a very limited range of motion that you need, you can kind of pare that down. So if you're kind of limiting the motion, or you have a wider shot, more than likely this will work just fine for you. But if you have a need to be able to get in real tight for product shots and things like that, you might wind up having to spend a heck of a lot more money to get something that's actually precise, and not using these mechanical tracker systems, because I just get the feeling that it doesn't matter how well crafted they are, just by virtue of their needing to use friction against those rail, like against a third rail in there, it's not going to be able to be as precise as something that actually has a dedicated, motor stepper motor inside of it to actually like hold that tracker shot and be able to like move just smoothly throughout the entirety of the motion. Otherwise, using this mechanical system, I just think that there's a lot of drawbacks for this specific scenario. It doesn't break down into smaller pieces, which really makes kind of transporting this thing a little bit of an issue if you need to like carry it around, because those rods, you are going to wind up with not only the rods, but there's caps on either side of them for the rods themselves. So the overall length, it's pretty long, and trying to lug this thing around where you can't like probably put it into a backpack unless you probably have to have like an actual serious, like 90-liter backpack or something like that in order to slip this thing into it. Otherwise, it's going to be too big for most normal backpacks, which, again, cost saving, and probably there's other factors that are involved. Like, I don't think you'll be able to get a rod system that you could break down, just because those, what are they called? The bearings that you have that roll on the rods, if it comes across a split in the rod where, you have to put the rods together, it's going to bump and ruin your shot. So I can understand why it doesn't break down. So if getting something that's compact is what you need, you're going to have to look at a few other different systems. I've seen some other systems that are out there that actually do break down. And the way that they're designed, they're not using the typical roller bearings that roll along a rail system. They use something else. And that way you can break it down into smaller pieces. So bear that in mind. If you need something that's compact and be able to move around, this is not going to be the system for you. So when it comes to pros, it's inexpensive, as I mentioned, when it comes to the motorized slider that can pan, track, and do panoramas. Most of the time, these other motorized systems that are out there that have something like, as I mentioned, a dedicated stepper motor for doing something like tracker shots or doing tilt on top of that, when you start adding additional stepper motors, you're upping the cost significantly, especially when you need to have that incorporated into a controller. It's really going to make things a lot more expensive. And it uses industry standard batteries. It's the same batteries for this that are also used to like power my Blackmagic Pixel Cinema camera, which is what I'm using. Or this is a Blackmagic Pixel Cinema camera 4K. Man, it's a mouthful. I have a bunch of other lights, also LED lights that I use, and they all use these same batteries. So it was really nice to be able to have the batteries that I already had laying around. Now, granted, this thing, I've slapped on one of these batteries, and I was using it for hours and hours and hours yesterday, and I think it took off like one little tiny little slice on the indicator. So there was still like probably a good 10 hours or more left in the thing. So, I mean, geez, it's very efficient when it comes to power consumption. And then when you've actually figured out how to use the controller, it's pretty easy to get the slider set up and ready to shoot. You just set the start point, the end point, and then you bounce back up the menu, go into the video shot mode, go down and decide whether or not you want to just have it do a one-shot thing or to have it loop. Real easy to set up as soon as you figure out how to use the controller anyways. Now, the motor is extremely quiet, and the only time that I've actually heard the motor make some noise is that if you put it up to 100%. Now, when you put it up to 100%, it really moves pretty fast. More than likely, you're probably not going to use it at 100%, and if you do, just use like a shotgun mic, because as I was recording it yesterday, I couldn't even hear it as it was moving back and forth, and I had it at like 65%. So, real super quiet motor. Now, it's probably good for time-lapse photography. I don't know. I didn't set it up for time-lapse photography. Looking at the menu systems, it's kind of complicated, but I believe that once you get used to that menuing system, probably are going to be able to set it up pretty well. But I know for a fact that just setting it up to do like an interview type of shot, like what I was using it for yesterday when I was just recording, well, I was trying to record the review for this slider system, it seemed to work really well for that. But anything like macro shots, like I mentioned earlier, just probably not going to work for you. And it's also really lightweight because it does have carbon fiber tubes. There are other systems that are out there that use aluminum tubes, and I think that there's actually some also that are real heavy duty that use steel tubes, and that's going to make these systems so much heavier. But this thing gets really, really light, so I was really pleased with how lightweight it was. It makes it setting it up a lot easier too, especially if you're going to put it onto two tripods, which is one of the other things that I should mention is that it does come with a plate in the middle that you can set it up onto a single tripod, But depending on what you're using to film with, if you're using something that's got any kind of weight to it, you're probably going to want to use two either tripods or use two light stands. That's what I did, as I just set up a couple of light stands. It's got nice, I think it has 3/8 inch and 1/4 inch on the bottom of it. It might be 2/4 inch. Let me just go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and say that those are 2/4 inch. So it still doesn't really matter. It would be nice if it had an option for 3 inch. So that way, if you had some really heavy duty C stands or something like that, and you had 3/8 inch mounts that you wanted to use just to really make this thing super solid, you could use that as an option. But 1/4 inch, I mean, given the fact that the thing's really light and given how the weight rating for it is fairly low, it's not meant for like production cameras by any means. This is meant for prosumer usage, hobbyists, things like that. You're not going to be dumping 10, 20 pounds on the thing. And if you are, probably isn't going to really work very well because I think it's meant for something that's a little bit more lightweight. So I believe it's like a 6-pound maximum at the most. And even then, I had a really lightweight camera on it. And I suspect that probably you're not going to want to go beyond something like that if you want to really be able to, especially if you're going to do something like vertical shots. I think you're going to start struggling with it because it has a very small motor on it. Now, granted, for doing horizontal shots, it did just fine. So that's my take on it. And I think that if you're just a hobbyist and you're looking for doing some really smooth panning shots with doing some interviews or something along those lines, and you don't need it for tight-end shots, this thing's going to work great. And for the money, you really can't get anything better. I've looked and I did my homework. This really did come out on top when it comes to that specific sort of usage pattern. But I don't think there were very many people that were talking about, in the review sections anyways, about how this fared when it came to doing things like tracking product shots or tracking macro photography, where I just don't see this thing being very viable for that scenario. But other scenarios, I think it's going to do absolutely fantastic. And I think that's going to do it for me, and I hope that you will get some value out of my reviews. If you do, give me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate that. And if you like my reviews, then subscribe to my channel. I review things quite often, and I have a lot of fun doing it. And I will see you guys next time on another of Adam's Reviews.